according to the United Nations, until last November, there were almost 5 million of Ukraine refugees that applied for temporary residence in European countries. However, not only Ukrainians were the only ones affected, since thousands of Latinos were trying to escape the war zone desperately, and they moved to other countries. Surprisingly, the Ecuadorian community was the biggest one among all the Latinos in Ukraine, even above Brazil, considering our sizes geographically. Ecuador had 850 citizens in Ukraine, and for us, for the government, that was a surprise. And there are two reasons behind this. I'm going to take the first one now, and the second one later. So the first one is the economic benefit of studying a master's, bachelor, or PhD in Ukraine for us. It's cheap, and that's why the 85% of all Ecuadorians in Ukraine were studying. And as you can see in this graphic, this is showing how in recent years there was a high increase for studying in Ukraine from Ecuador, but not all of them come back. I wanted to share also two migrants' stories that I found interesting. There are many of them, but I focus on two. The first one is Diego Moncayo's story, a 20-year-old guy trapped in a zone near the border with Russia. The thing is that he was the last one that returned. He returned 2 weeks after all the humanitarian flights. This was followed in the country. And the other story is a group of Ecuadorians who traveled by foot to Budapest. And in their path, they found discrimination and violence. You can find interviews in this about this. They are testifying. They were hit by Ukrainian soldiers, according to them, because they were not Europeans or Ukrainians. I also wanted to focus on the legal actors that were involved in the repatriation. Since the Ecuadorian government worked closely with various actors to develop the plan of action, they worked with the International Organization for Migrants, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and there are two other Ecuadorian laws that make this possible. And also, because of these laws, the Ecuadorian families from these students were manifesting about this. They were making pressure on this. I'm sorry, next. Remember I told you the second reason, there is a new model of trafficking. Thanks to the war in Ukraine, the government found out a new way of trafficking called coyoterismo académico, which is academic trafficking. The families testified that they hired services from agencies, studies agencies from Ecuador, and they offered English courses, language courses, accommodation, other student services, and the application processes for the universities, but that wasn't scammed, even though that there was a surprise also that many of the students in Ukraine did not have an official passport, and the Prime Minister of International Relations had to create new biometric passports for the humanitarian flights. And I found interesting the migrants' motivations to migrate. Why? Because according to the minister, more than 200 of the students refused to go back to the country in the middle of a war. So they prefer to stay in Ukraine, or they prefer to move to other country, or they looked for other humanitarian flights and they escaped in flights from Mexico, from Spain, from the United States. But they did not want to go back. So for me it's interesting this, next please. For me it's interesting this factor because as an example, they had already pets. They were building their networking in Ukraine. So in this case, I'm guessing, my opinion, they were creating their lives there in Ukraine. They were not looking for coming back. One reason is because what you study in countries in Europe, some of them you cannot find in South America. You cannot find a job about that. So I wanted to conclude comparing how at the beginning, before the war, there were maybe individual motivations for the migrants But at the end, they built a community. So the motivation ended as a community one.